Hello everyone, my name is Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I'm going to indulge in a little fan-fueled excitement, as well as a little speculation. Like many longtime Marvel fans, I am so excited to see the X-Men and the Fantastic Four join the MCU. I'm a lifelong Marvel fan and a huge X-Men fan. I hope my previous videos have made that abundantly clear. The X-Men has been my favorite superhero team for years, and I have many fond memories of watching the cartoons and following the comics. I'm an X-Men fan through and through, plain and simple. Now, I don't deny that the Fox-era movies had their moments, and I did enjoy them to some extent, but for the most part, I have more criticisms than praise. And now, they're officially relics of another era, because there's no more avoiding it. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is the alpha and omega of all things Marvel these days. The X-Men are coming to the MCU, and the MCU will be better because of it. And I admit, I was among those who thought the X-Men would never join the MCU. With all the differing movie rights, that might as well have been an adamantium barrier of sorts. Then, Disney just bought Fox outright, and now that barrier is gone. And I'll be the first to say I am so glad I was wrong. And even if it's still premature, X-Men fans like myself can't help but dream. And in the spirit of Charles Xavier himself, we can envision a world where the X-Men fight alongside the likes of Thor, Captain Marvel, and Spider-Man. The potential is truly uncanny, if that's not too fitting a word. So, in that spirit, I'd like to share some of my hopes for the X-Men when they join the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But please note, these aren't rumors and these aren't fan theories. This is just me and my inner X-Men fan indulging in what may or may not happen in the years to come. On the other side of that coin, I'm still a realist. There's a wide gap between what's possible and what's probable. But since we're at such an early stage, let's just have a little fun exploring the possibilities. The first issue Marvel Studios will face in bringing the X-Men to the MCU is explaining why the mutants have been absent to this point. Because it's clear now, superpowers exist in the MCU. Superhuman super soldiers exist. Aliens exist as well. Magic exists. Gods exist in the form of Asgardians. And through the Eternals, godlike aliens even exist. But nobody has ever even uttered the word mutant. Now, there's a legitimate and legally binding reason why that is. When Fox owned the movie rights to the X-Men, they didn't just have control over the characters. They had control over the very concept of mutants. No other film franchise, superhero or otherwise, could even say that word without running afoul of Fox's lawyers. But in the MCU, those legal quirks don't matter anymore. And most moviegoers aren't well versed in the machinations of movie rights to begin with. So those same moviegoers will be a bit confused if there just happens to be this large population of people born with superpowers. Where have they been all this time? Why weren't they ever recruited by the Avengers? Why didn't they help out in the Battle of New York? Why didn't they help out in the battle against Ultron? Why didn't they help out in the battle against Thanos? This is not a trivial oversight. Their absence is more than a little conspicuous. If they just happen to show up, then that's not just poor storytelling, that's a major plot hole. And a cohesive cinematic universe can't have too many of those. Luckily, Kevin Feige's track record at keeping the MCU concise is beyond reproach. I'm confident he'll find a way to explain this issue of absent mutants. It's just a matter of building the right story around it. There are many ways Marvel Studios can go about explaining the lack of mutants in the MCU to this point, and some explanations are more cinematic than others. There are even a few successful precedents in Marvel's not-too-distant past. Back in the early 2000s, Marvel produced an animated series called X-Men Evolution. And if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. The entire series is on Disney Plus as of this recording. On top of making many famous X-Men characters teenagers, it also had a novel concept for mutants as a whole. When the show begins, mutants exist, but their presence is kept a closely guarded secret. Mutants were treated like UFOs, Bigfoot, and healing crystals. They were, to coin a phrase, in the closet. An apt metaphor given the X-Men's parallels with the LGBTQ movement. Then, in later seasons, they were outed by forces beyond their control and by people with questionable agendas. they then had to deal with the many ramifications. It made for some amazing stories that brought out the best in these characters and the various themes of X-Men as a whole. And this could work just as well in the MCU. In terms of a larger plot, it actually makes a lot of sense. Within the current MCU lore, which is subject to change, mind you, superpowered beings are still relatively new in the cultural zeitgeist. They exist, but the public's acceptance of them is mixed at best. Sure, they celebrate the Avengers, but they rightly fear the Hulk. And after Thanos, they have even more reasons to be concerned. Now add random people born with random unpredictable powers to the mix. That's a different story. Too different, in fact. Especially after the events of Avengers Endgame. Characters like Charles Xavier, who seek peace rather than conflict, have a valid reason for keeping mutants a secret. He and countless other mutants are scared. They're not ready to be outed, again drawing parallels to the LGBTQ movement. Maybe characters like Nick Fury even help keep that secret, just like he did in X-Men Evolution. You can build entire stories about how mutants struggle to stay hidden, and from that story, you can also explore the implications of what happens once they're outed. If it's all the right themes, and it sows the seeds for a new branch of stories in the MCU, some in the past and some in the present. But that's not the only possibility. In terms of giving a more concrete reason for why mutants are absent in the MCU, there are much bolder possibilities that could rock the MCU for years to come. Much like the comics, the MCU's history is rich and constantly evolving. The time travel elements in both Doctor Strange and Avengers Endgame promise to shake it up even more. And regardless of how mutants show up in the MCU at first, their presence will still change history. And I'm not just talking about the obvious ones either. Mixing Wolverine's extensive history with Captain America's would be interesting, especially now that Steve Rogers' story as Captain America is effectively done. And given the Eternals link to mutants in the comics, that could also open things up. It would effectively mirror the source material, but the absence of mutants could have far greater implications. So, picture a scenario like this. Mutants have always existed in the MCU. Their numbers were small, but they started growing rapidly after World War II. They grew so fast that it scared one too many people. And in that fear, they started to hate. And from that hate, they attacked. Maybe they hit with mutant-hunting robots like the Sentinels. Maybe they attack with a mutant-killing virus, a la the Legacy virus. Maybe they found some exceptionally powerful mutant who could rid the world of their kind. All of these elements come straight from the comics. The most notable is M-Day, a moment that sprung from the notorious House of M event in the comics. In this event, the Scarlet Witch essentially has a mental breakdown and casts a spell that nearly wipes out the entire mutant population. Now, she may not be classified as a mutant in the MCU, but she clearly has the power and the mental instability to do something like this. The events of WandaVision may even set that up. Now, mutants found a way to survive this event in the comics. But what if they didn't in the MCU? What if there was a conflict so destructive that certain people, who may or may not have psychic powers, decided it was best that humanity just forget that mutants existed altogether, so much so that the word isn't even uttered? And it wouldn't be the first time humanity has tried to erase an atrocity from history. There are some real-world parallels with that. But now, imagine the truth coming out. Imagine the kind of conflict and tension that could inspire. That kind of world would need the X-Men, more so than it would need the Avengers. That's the kind of scenario I hope for the most. One that has mutants act as a minority that has suffered a legitimate, horrific atrocity. That brings out the best in the X-Men in the comics. I think it could do even more for them in the MCU. Like I said earlier, the MCU's history is vast, rich, and constantly evolving, literally when you account for time travel. And the X-Men is a franchise that's every bit as grand in terms of scope and scale. And combining all that lore should make for some potent results. Certain characters, X-Men and Avengers alike, have connections that go beyond the mutant narrative. Given his age, Wolverine's connections alone are worthy of their own cinematic universe. He has close personal ties to the likes of Steve Rogers, the Incredible Hulk, Black Widow, and Squirrel Girl even. Don't ask about that one. And whichever actor ends up playing Wolverine should have plenty of opportunities for crossovers. In addition to Wolverine, You've got characters like Rogue, who started off as a villain for Miss Marvel. And some are already hoping that she shows up in Captain Marvel too. I know because I'm one of them. I'd love to see a scene where Carol and Rogue clash like they did in the comics. Now, I have a feeling it's a bit too early for that. We probably won't see something like that until Captain Marvel 3, if there is one. But it's one of those stories that's definitely worth waiting for. Then there's also Illyana Rasputin's ties to Doctor Strange in the world of magic. There's Storm's personal history with Black Panther. There's also a rather lengthy tradition in the comics of Mystique infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D., both as an ally and as an enemy. Then there are Magneto's ties to the Maximoff twins, although that has been subject to revisions lately. Again, that's a long story. There are many new connections to make. Many great characters have emerged in X-Men who have gone on to become great allies, enemies, and rivals. The MCU has always been adept at making those connections. The presence of the X-Men only gives Kevin Feige and co. more to work with. With so many stories to tell, it's hard to determine which ones Marvel Studios will incorporate. However, there's one story in particular that I hope they select, and it just so happens it's a very recent story relevant to the X-Men's long history. Now, if you aren't familiar with 50 years worth of X-Men comics, then I have good news for you. This might be the best possible time to delve into the world of the X-Books. These past few years have seen a renaissance in the world of all things X-Men, and the details of this resurgence could fit perfectly within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It all started with a 10-issue series called House of X Powers of 10. I already did a previous video detailing that event. Check it out for a more thorough breakdown of why this story is so groundbreaking for the X-Men. But the short of it is, within these books, writer Jonathan Hickman effectively reorganizes the entire mutant world. For years, mutants fought to survive in various sanctuaries and enclaves. Some lasted longer than others, but most ended the same, with mutants either being attacked or slaughtered. That finally changed after Charles Xavier formed Krakoa, a fully functioning mutant nation. This place, a living island no less, isn't just a sanctuary. It's a full-fledged society in which mutants are creating their own identity and culture. They're no longer trying to fit into a world that keeps rejecting them. They're making their own. And some people have a problem with that, but they're no longer in a position to attack. It marks an incredible evolution of the X-Men story. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do so. I'll place a link in the description to the graphic novel. And once you read it, you'll see plenty of things that would probably work beautifully in the MCU. Because if mutants are to work as a franchise, they must embody the necessary themes. Now, the Fox movies tried to do this, but for the most part, the results were mixed. Some were downright ugly. See X3. But they all tried to embrace the larger metaphor of mutants representing an oppressed minority. With House of X and Krakoa, this concept is taken to another level, one that Fox never got a chance to try. And I think it's important for Marvel Studios to try something distinct, because unlike other Marvel franchises that entered the MCU, the X-Men has baggage from nearly 20 years of movies. To start anew, they need to stand out in a very particular way, one that'll completely cut ties with the Fox era for good. And House of X is a perfect way to do just that. It would be both ambitious and fitting. It would have X-Men fans like me cheering as loudly as they did when Cap first lifted Thor's hammer. Unfortunately, and this is where the realistic side of me comes into play, I don't think it's that likely. As a lifelong X-Men fan, I have a lengthy wish list of things I'd like to see once the X-Men join the MCU. I understand that only a small part of that list will likely make it onto the screen, but I also know there's a difference between what's possible and what's probable. Right now, Marvel Studios is in a precarious state. Avengers Endgame is over. They completed an incredible cinematic epic that grossed billions at the box office. This in and of itself is an incredible achievement. But where do you go from here? With so many actors and actresses leaving the franchise, how do they keep up their unprecedented winning streak? These were tough questions to ask before all of Hollywood got shut down due to a global pandemic. Now, the answers are a lot more limited. And I can't imagine Marvel and their Disney overlords are inclined to take big risks at the moment. Like every other movie studio out there, they need an added dose of certainty and stability, if only to get the industry going again. Even with a lengthy slate of movies still in the works, there's no guarantee that Marvel Studios will keep on hitting home runs. It only takes one misstep to disrupt their whole plan. And depending on how many there are, it could affect the way they choose to bring mutants into the MCU. Assuming the most realistic outcome, that is to say the movies continue to dominate even with a misstep or two, I still suspect that Marvel Studios will choose the path of least resistance when it comes to putting mutants in the MCU. That likely means a story that doesn't really push the envelope. Now that could imply a lot of things, but it probably entails a simple, non-radical solution. That might be the most risk they're willing to take. And in terms of explaining why mutants were absent for so long, I think there's a good chance it'll just be shrugged off. It could just be the case that mutants were always there, but in such small numbers that nobody gave them a second thought. And in my opinion, that's not a very satisfying solution, and it creates some significant plot holes, but it's probably the easiest solution. Therefore, I'd say it's the most likely. We'll still get the X-Men, we'll still get the costumes, the mansion, the jet, the powers, and all the conflicts that come with it. You'll just have that distinct MCU style. And I'd be okay with this. I love the X-Men and I'll be first in line to see that movie, but it'll only be so bold. Perhaps if the first movie does well at the box office, that'll change. And it's hard to say. For now, I'm just assuming that everyone in Hollywood is going to minimize risk to the greatest extent possible. That means we probably won't get something as novel as we hope. Make no mistake, mutants entering the MCU will have a major impact on Marvel Studios, on Disney, and the movie industry as a whole. And I'm excited for it. I am so ready for a new era of X-Men movies. I hope they match and exceed the best of what Fox gave us. But I still intend to manage my expectations. The superhero genre, and the world as a whole, is sure to be a very different place by the time the cameras start rolling on an X-Men movie. The trends between now and then are sure to affect the final product. The MCU, like any healthy franchise, must keep evolving and adapting. But fittingly, that's what the X-Men do best. And in terms of the bigger picture, I think the MCU needs the X-Men. They don't just represent a new franchise for Disney to profit from. Who they are and what they stand for has never been more relevant. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is full of heroes, aliens, and godlike beings. These larger-than-life beings represent our highest ideals, concepts that are beyond human. But the X-Men, and mutants as a whole, are defined by their humanity. They're not super soldiers. They're not products of science. They're not billionaire genius playboys in high-tech armor. They're just people. Ordinary, everyday people who just happen to be born a certain way. Now, these people have to find their place in this world. It'll turn some into heroes, it'll turn some into villains, and there's plenty of room for action, drama, romance, and humor along the way. Nobody knows what form it'll ultimately take. I just hope it's something truly uncanny. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and stay safe.